Section B, June 2021, paper 1. Let's get started straight away and start with the 5-mark question. This is an explain question. The likely impact of diminishing marginal productivity, so not utility, productivity, of labour on cabin crew staffing levels. Refer to extract A in your answer. So this question is assessing a tiny bit of the spec. It says 3.3.2 and specifically B. It says derivation of short-run cost curves from the assumption of diminishing marginal productivity. Now the reason why I'm focusing on this, in our live classes we do special classes for the A-star students, as you can literally be assessed on a tiny spec point, 3 words in a tiny spec point. So we make sure all these tiny bits of the spec, where mostly are overlooked by students, we make sure students are fully clued up on them. So it's a great example where Edexcel have assessed a tiny bit of the spec. And again, this just emphasizes my point of content mastery. You need to make sure the spec, you have it on lock, you know every single point in the spec, even these tiny little words, this tiny little bit of diminishing marginal productivity. So back onto the question, the way I would start this question to pick up the K marks is defining diminishing marginal productivity. But for those of you who do not know diminishing marginal productivity, of course, like I said, it's very similar to the concept of diminishing marginal utility. So let's use diminishing marginal utility to help find the definition for this. So a good example of diminishing marginal utility would be like something like ice creams. So for every additional unit of ice cream I consume, the additional increase in satisfaction would decline. And that is pretty much exactly the same and the exact same wording, just changing a few words around, how I would define diminishing marginal productivity, since of course it has the same words which are diminishing and marginal, and these of course mean the same thing in context. The only thing that is really changing is productivity. And how do we define productivity? Is output per unit time. So the way I would define diminishing marginal productivity is for an additional unit of labour, the additional increase in productivity declines. So essentially swapping out utility for now productivity. Okay, so like I said, for an additional unit of labour, the additional increase in productivity declines. But now that's the definition. Let's actually go about answering the question. So explaining how the impact of diminishing marginal productivity will affect the labour on cabin crew staffing levels. And let's have a quick look at extract A, because as you know, of course, this 5-mark question will have application. So let's pick up some of these application marks. So title, marginal productivity of cabin crew. They're responsible for loading and providing in-flight meals, is planning to reduce the number of cabin crew members. But before we look at the extracts, let's use a bit of common sense. We're talking about flights and planes. And if you think about the corridor on planes or flights, it of course is quite small, it's quite limited. Thus you can understand this concept of diminishing marginal productivity, as you could have 10 flight attendants on that flight, but usually you can only fit 2 flight attendants or 2 people at the same time on that flight corridor. Therefore there's no point for more than, because on flights there's usually 2 corridors on each side, you know, like where they bring the trolley and things like that, but there's 2 workers on each corridor. Therefore there's no point of hiring any more workers than those 2, so 4 workers at a time, since they can only fit, there's a limited space, so they can only fit 4 workers on those corridors. So if we're thinking about the impact of this diminishing marginal productivity, of course the impact is going to be that flights are going to hire less workers, or just a set number of workers, as if they hire more workers, those workers cannot even, due to the limited space, cannot even be on the corridor to, like, you know, like on flights they sell like perfume and things like that, but they can't even be on the corridor since there's not enough space. Therefore, of course, it would not be worth it for these flight firms, these airline firms, to hire them. But let's have a look. Let's have a look at the extract. That's just my own personal thought, and let's see what the extract is saying. So, marginal productivity of the cabin crew is the title. It talks about the responsibilities of the cabin crew. United Airlines are looking to reduce the number of cabin crew. So again, that aligns with what I was thinking. So one effect is definitely going to be of the diminishing marginal productivity is that flight airlines firms are going to look to reduce the number of cabin crew. So United Airlines operates with 1 more cabin crew member, and that cabin crew member's marginal productivity is low, and therefore it means it is quite inefficient. So my assumption holds correct. And of course, just to finish that off, I've explained the impact of this diminishing marginal productivity. So the impact, of course, like the extract basically told us, is a reduction in staffing levels. Then just try to pick up a few application marks. And why is that? Again, just using some common sense. On flight corridors, of course, there's limited space for the trolley, for basically like the things they sell. And in the extract, they talk about in-flight meals, and of course, they pretty much bring that on the trolley as well. So I thought to include that. And then just a bit of analysis, a bit of like explanation of what I mean by that, as by hiring more workers, it's essentially what you learn in like specialisation, division of labour, but by hiring more workers, due to the limited space, the additional output per unit of labour declines. As of course, by having 2 workers on that flight corridor, they can pretty much do the job. The third worker can probably support those 2 workers, but the additional output of him is going to decline compared to the first 2 workers. But yeah, that is how I would answer that 5-mark question. Definitely a slightly unique 5-mark question compared to other 5-mark questions, but again, that means it's a really good one to practice, since of course unique questions, if you're prepared for the unique question, then most individuals will drop marks on these, and if you can make sure you're securing the marks in the unique questions, it means that, again, that's how grade boundaries work. If you're scoring marks where individuals are dropping marks, that is the route for the A star.